Deputy Captain Connolly.
Hirli agus is fadan law o ará fihinómid agam chun páirte glacu i spórach. So déine mé mo dhíhil an fihinómid sin úsáid go héfictach agus na ligi sa reachtaíoch seo díruas ar na ligi atá an ach níos táhachtaí go bhfuil deis cailse ag an rialtas athraithe cuimseach a dhéanamh cail siad an deis, níor happy siad an deis chun doling lúthláin lena dúthláin atá os ar góir maidiú le athru éráide COVID, breathimeacht, Israel. Chairperson, it's a long time since I had 20 minutes to make a contribution in this stall. I think the last time that the system allowed me 20 minutes was in relation to the O'Higgins report, which I made use of, and I hope I make effective use of this 20 minutes. So I want to make two preliminary comments before I go into the bulk of the few words I want to say, and I wasn't expecting to speak today. So that brings me to my first comment, that the changes, my colleague Thomas Pringle, Deputy Pringle, sits on the Business Committee, and he and the other colleagues on my left have fought a great battle not to change the arrangements, and in spite of that, the majority members of the committee changed the arrangements, so the lesser parties have less time. Actually, not less time, but less time by default, because they're pushed down the pecking order. I'm now up the pecking order today because, interestingly enough, a lot of government TDs, backbenchers, who cry out for time, didn't come in and use that time. So I couldn't let the moment pass without saying that, because really this bill was to go into another week and not be complete today. I think it's very important, because I think the government have been disingenuous in relation to saying there's not less time for the smaller parties. Actually there is, and it's by default that we're in here today, and I welcome that. And as they say, they did say in Latin, carpe diem, seize the day, seize the opportunity. So I will do that. The second comment I want to make is a preliminary comment. In the rough and tumble of politics, things are said. But earlier on today, Deputy Michael Moynihan talked about the previous Minister Sapone and singled her out. I think you were there, Minister. And I rarely do this, but I'm in my capacity now as an independent TD. And I just thought it really captures why we can't make that transformative change that's necessary, that I'm going to come back to, that we single out one independent TD for failing to deal with disability at a time where Fianna Fáil supported the government. Was it confidence and supply? And I'm not going to score political points, but that's actually the fact. You supported the government at that time. That government withdrew, just as one example, it withdrew the miserly, but it wasn't miserly to those affected who received it, 3180, the rehabilitative training allowance. And you remember we all got representations at the time, and that government, supported by Fianna Fáil, of which Catherine Sapone was just one member, and she wasn't the minister with the responsibility for disability. So I just couldn't let it go, and I was certainly, I hope, constructively critical of Catherine Sapone. But I think that attack really allows the government and the supporting government at the time, which was Fianna Fáil, off the hook. I have welcomed, Minister, the good things in this budget, and if you forgive me, I won't repeat them today because I want to zone in on a bigger. There's certainly good things in the budget, and I highlighted some of them on my last contribution. But this is a budget like no other, because it's a budget facing a time like no other. It is a time to make transformative change. And that word transformative has become almost a cliche, but we do that at our peril, to use the word transformative and make it a cliche, because we really need to make it a reality if we're going to survive. And if we're going to survive the challenges that face us, captured by climate change, biodiversity, a climate emergency, a biodiversity emergency, COVID, Brexit. And COVID and Brexit indeed, and I don't say it lightly, pale into insignificance in relation to what we're facing with climate change and flooding that we discussed yesterday and the day before. Deputy Michael McNamara raised his committee. I want to praise Deputy Michael McNamara, actually, for the Trojan work that he and the members cross-party, and this is what's important, and it relates to the budget, what they did on that committee. In a short period of time, they brought in the experts before them, produced a report, published it, and it was promptly ignored. and they actually managed to put Irish into it as well. Bhí píosa trí Gaeilge stihan, ní rá sé go léir umlán gá ceangach, ach rinne siad iireacht an Gaeilge chuirste. So they published that report, and it was absolutely ignored. And they highlighted, as he has said, the structural weaknesses in the system, and they were very obvious. So when we were standing up for the first time back in March to talk about the emergency legislation, I referred to a letter, and this is my 4th time referring to it, that we had received from a particular union highlighting, before COVID started, the serious situation in the health service. We didn't need a letter from the union, but the contents were stark in relation to the situation there and the lack of primary care. So we went into COVID with huge structural difficulties, huge inequality in our health system. And because of that, and that didn't happen accidentally, that happened as a result of government policy. I spent, I think, approximately 10 years of my life on a health forum, and I saw firsthand what happened when the Progressive Democrats were in coalition and led the privatisation of our health service, which comes back to the point Michael McNamara, Deputy Michael McNamara, I'm not saying he agreed with me, but in relation to nursing homes, it didn't happen by accident that 80% of our nursing homes became private. That just didn't happen, Minister. That happened as a result of government policy. And in fact, there was a time, not too long ago, when it was the other way around. And as a result of government policy, I don't think it was Fianna Fáil policy, but unfortunately you were led by the nose by the Progressive Democrats, and you instituted a policy that ran down the public health system and absolutely resourced the private system. Now, I saw this at first hand. I saw in 2007 and 8 reports coming back from the health executive saying cost refurbishment, why beds were closed. So beds were closed in 6-7 before the crash as a result of government policy. And then fast forward to COVID, and COVID then and NEFID, and I'm not here to criticise NEFID, but from day one it didn't have a broad representation. They did their job as they saw fit as medics, but there wasn't a broad representation. And so there was no voice for the nursing homes. There was no voice on that for the meat factories or for the direct provision centres. Afterwards, a narrative was given that there was a voice, but there was not. I checked all of the minutes until I ran out of energy, and I did not see a discussion of the nursing homes, the meat factories, in March, April, certainly May, but by May they were being mentioned. So what I'm saying here is the COVID highlighted our structural inequalities. And the resources were used for that then, as opposed to looking at the nursing homes, which we knew were in crisis, because we've had years of HECRA reports pointing out the good things, absolutely, but also highlighting the problems in terms of infection control, lack of staff, or not enough mix with the staff, the absence of care plans, all highlighted. So we went into COVID, and HECRA knew exactly what was going on in the nursing homes. I'm not sure if anybody in NEFID asked them in the very beginning, what is the state of nursing homes, or would you like to tell us? I'm not sure. Maybe the inquiry that Deputy McNamara's committee asked for will happen in due course in relation to what happened in the nursing homes. So this budget, and we can play with figures, and I'm not going to, Minister, because you're very good at figures and you did tremendous work on the Public Accounts Committee, and I'm not someone to argue with you about figures. But this is not about figures. This is about what budget is necessary at this point in our history where we have all agreed there is no going back. And from day one, 2 messages came out of COVID. We seem to have lost them now. One was, we're all in this together, and the second one is, there is no going back. We simply can't go back because our economy, the way we were doing it, was not sustainable. Now, if we say that, and then for language to mean something, then we need a budget to reflect that there's no going back. And without doubt, you did the right thing with the PUP payment and with the wage subsidy, without a doubt, and I have praised you for that. But yesterday, we looked at a sunset clause, and I'm going to bring it straight back now to the topic. And the sunset clause was running out on the 9th of November for the extra powers, the draconian powers that we gave to the government, the guards, to close down public houses. And ye came forward as a government and asked us to extend that because we insisted in the opposition and forced ye to come back before the Dáil, and ye accepted that. You came back in and had some measure of debate. And then ye asked, and you won by majority, that that clause would be extended until next June, without any evidence, without any basis. And if I put it in a nutshell, you extended the powers to the guards in a time where the pubs are closed, which is quite ironic. All the pubs are closed, and we've given them extra power to go in and inspect those pubs that are closed. And in the period that it was in since September, they never once, before the pubs closed, needed those powers. Now, that's a strange type of narrative to come in and say you need to give draconian powers, although the minister said we're never going to use them, honestly, but it's deterrent, a deterrent. And that same thing is there with the climate change. Rather than bringing us all on board together and indeed recognising that we didn't lead, we did not lead. The people on the ground led us, and the children led us, and we declared a climate emergency and a biodiversity emergency. And what do? We then associate climate change action with a carbon tax, not just a once-off tax, but tied in for the next few years. Now, whatever about the pros and cons of a carbon tax, and I have my own views on it, it is not a good message and it's not effective to associate the need for behaviour change with a carbon tax, while my colleagues, and I couldn't put it any better, Deputy Breach Smith and Deputy Paul Murphy outlined this excellently this morning in relation to not taxing those who are polluting the most. So now we have a budget that's tied in a carbon tax that will affect the poorest and those most disenfranchised by our unequal system. That's not a good message. And equally, it's not a good message to send out in time of COVID that we will punish you if you don't behave, when there's no need for that punishment. There's a need for education, encouragement, and leadership. And that leadership has been sorely lacking. If we look at the budget itself, you brought in a PUP payment, which was very good, $350. We all agreed with you and we all praised you. And that was a recognition that that was the minimum that was needed for those losing their jobs. But if it was a minimum needed for those losing their jobs, then suddenly that should have spurred you to say, well, if they're unemployed now, what about the other people that are unemployed? Do they not need $350? And spurred you into looking at it. What is a basic wage to live on, given our salaries, which I don't make an apology for. We earn salaries, we do our work. But what is a basic living wage for people so that everyone can participate in society? You didn't do that. Not alone did you not do that, but then as quickly as you could, you reduced the PUP payment. Then you did a welcome U-turn on that, and now you're going to tax. It just doesn't make sense, Minister, when we want to keep so many people on board. The minimum wage went up by 10 cents. It's an insult. Social welfare didn't move, pension didn't move. Certainly there were movements in relation to carers in the annual allowance, and I welcome that. And there were additional home care hours for carers. I welcome that. Not for carers, but for those that they care for. But you see, if I stand here and we look at the 5 million extra hours, and then I go back to Claddagh, or I go back to Galway City, and I say, what do these 5 million mean? It's certainly welcome. I think somebody mentioned a basic care package of 20-something hours a week. I actually don't know anyone on that care package in Galway. Maybe it's just me. I know families on 10. I know families on 12. I know families caring for someone who has dementia, morning, noon and night, with 12 hours a week. Literally, up at 5 in the morning. You know, the Tánaiste that talks about the people that get up early in the morning, and we have those that really don't get to bed because they're caring all the time, and they might get a nap during the day. And I'm not exaggerating, and I'm only using the anecdote to go to the general. If we're asking people to care and we're giving them 10 or 12 hours after a waiting time, the extra 5 million hours has to be put into perspective. Who are we actually helping? Are we clearing some of the backlog, or what is it we're doing? And so, can you today, Minister, stand here and say somebody who's caring for somebody with dementia 24/7 and is getting about 12 hours a week home help, no respite, respite has gone in COVID, that's not a way. These are people who are a fundamental part of the economy. The economy can't thrive without our carers, and significantly the majority are women, which tells its own story, and that no way diminishes the men that are in caring positions as well. But it does give added significance to our failure to deal with treating carers with respect, so that they can treat the vulnerable and the sick with dignity and respect. In relation to the help to buy, I really think it's nothing short of shocking to extend that. Why? I'm no expert on figures, so I'll take the experts. So we'll take the ESRI. The Home to Buy scheme is a poorly targeted policy likely to fuel house price growth. A poorly targeted policy likely to fuel house price growth. That's the scheme that you're extending. There were cost overruns, and it has cost more than 300 million to date, despite the anticipated cost, and you're very familiar with this from the public accounts, with overruns, 113 million. That's from the ESRI. The SJI said the HTB has artificially stimulated the property market by providing a benefit to those that need it least. So those that need it least are now getting a boost. In the meanwhile, we have a housing, the word crisis doesn't capture it. So we'll take Galway again, somebody waiting on a waiting list since 2003, and I cannot get an answer as to how they've never been, it might be 5, just to be careful, never once in 15 to 17 years been offered a house. That's the extent of the dysfunction of the housing crisis in Galway and the housing service that we're giving them. And of course we're spending so much on homelessness, which we have to. I walk every day to where I stay in my privileged accommodation, and I walk past people sleeping in doorways. This morning I saw somebody taking off, presumably doing fantastic work, but presumably confirming that the person was still alive at the door, and the numbers. Now, I don't know how any government can say we've a thriving economy if that's what's happening. It's simply not possible. The two don't go together. We are putting over 1 billion, and again, Minister, I'd ask you, with your background, can you justify that amount of money going through HAP, RAS and long-term leasing, and not say that it's boosting the prices in the private market? We have to stop HAP. That doesn't mean we can stop it overnight. So let's not waste time and come back and say, I want HAP stopped overnight. I do not. It's there. I wish it wasn't there. I wish we had built houses, but we didn't. Fine Gael and the Labour Party enshrined HAP in housing legislation and said that's the only game in town. That was 2014 or 15, and from then on, HAP is the only game in town. I see TDs nodding, and all of us nod. That's the only language that was used in Galway City. HAP is the only game in town. So from 2009 up to a year ago, no houses were built in Galway because HAP was the only game in town. But Simon Community told us that most people were priced out of the market in terms of rent, they couldn't get it. So your policy is sick, and it's now enshrined again in the budget because you've increased more money in relation to those schemes, long-term leasing, and indeed when I read the paper, I see properties being now singled out for long-term leasing back to the County Council in Dublin and the City Council for long-term leasing rather than public land and public housing. My time is running out. I want to mention two last things. One is the Office of Public Works. And I absolutely see no reason why, who I have great admiration for and do great work, why they can't be used more effectively in relation to our housing crisis, rather than a land development agency that has no background and no statutory underpinning. Perhaps you might reflect on that, Minister, the Office of Public Works, with their vast experience. The last group I want to mention in 15 seconds is over 66, and it's been mentioned by many people. ESRI again, I'll quote for them, 65,000 people over the age of 66 who reported being in some form of paid work in the final quarter of 19. Such workers have nothing. Nothing. And all of the schemes that you've brought in have given them nothing. So we encourage them to work, we make them work, and then we do not provide for them.
I now call on Deputy O'Donnell.